Nice to see you all again. And I have a few things that I'd like us to do today. I just want to run them by you. So first of all, I wanted to share a few resources that I put together since our last class. I've had a couple of full days of work, so I couldn't do everything I wanted, but I was able to, just based on the questions you asked and some of the things that you said you were interested in, and Katie's question about Mesopotamia, I was able to contact a colleague and then just put a few things together for you all. And I also wanted to share a couple of syllabi and assignment sheets, just things that we use here in environmental studies that might be helpful. I know that we're talking a lot about really big picture social, structural issues, and I do that in my research and writing, but in my teaching, I'm obviously always trying to bring this sort of broader understanding down to the ground in terms of concrete lesson plans, assignments, and so on. So I thought I would share a few of those things with you. And then I wanted to revisit a question that was raised at the very end of our last class that David asked, actually, about whether the Dust Bowl was preventable. And I think, David, you framed it as a question about were there any organizations like putting out calls for action that if we had heeded those calls, we could have avoided the pain of the Dust Bowl. And in that moment, I was really thinking about organizations and couldn't, grasp a good example in the last 3 minutes of class to kind of summarize what I thought. But right afterwards, I was just like, wow, there's so many things that could have, like, points at which things could have gone a different direction. So I thought I would summarize a few of those just based on research I've done and research I've read. Won't be comprehensive, but I thought just to give you something to think about. And I also think that might be a nice way to frame our discussion of the readings for today. So after that, I want to get into talking about the readings and really hear about what captured your attention, whether anything made you think in new ways about how we imagine what constitutes environmental solutions, and then think about how do we bring this big picture understanding sort of down to the ground and think about what it means for us as teachers. Does that all sound okay? Or does anyone have objections or questions? Okay, awesome. So to get started, I wanted to share a few things with you. So first of all, I had to do it kind of quickly, but I put a few things just. These are some readings, some names of authors, things that I found helpful just based on some of the questions that came up in the last class. So I won't go through it because we don't have a lot of time today, but I want you to, you can look that over. You might not want to do it now, but maybe in the summer after you've had a few weeks of relaxation, it's something that you can come back to whenever it might be helpful. And Katie, your question about, Katie, didn't you ask about Mesopotamia?
I did, yes.
Okay, awesome. And so I was able to contact a colleague and they got back to me and I put their response in that document. So he said he was not an expert in Mesopotamia, but he had some good starting point ideas. And so the other things that I wanted to share were, here, let me pull them off my desktop. So I just put into the chat the Intro to Environmental Studies syllabus that it's a class, like I said, I co-teach with a biologist on campus. And this year, because we were making special accommodations for some of the students, given that part of our class was on Zoom and part of it was in person, we actually have like all of our slides for every lecture we gave over the course of the year that are all in one place. And if you're interested in anything that's in that syllabus, and if you email me, I'm happy to give you the slides that we use, especially not because you might need the slides, but because there's a lot of different reading resources and things like that. We update the syllabus every year, so it will look different next year than it does now, but we try to keep it really contemporary, focused on issues the students might be thinking about on any given year. So the other one I wanted to share, and this is a class called Unequal Footprints on the Earth. It's really an introduction to environmental sociology, but I think at the very bottom of that syllabus, So there's some interesting readings there, some that deal with science, some that might be relevant to your different disciplines. But there are also a few assignments. All the assignments for that class are at the bottom of the syllabus. And I've talked with I've got a lot of friends that teach at different, grade levels and things like that. And some of them I think could be interesting or adaptable for different disciplines outside my own. So I just thought if you're interested in that, you could check it out. The other last thing that I wanted to share is an assignment I do in a different class, a kind of social movements, environmental movements class. And this I started to do because students, I think somebody mentioned last time, Leslie, I think it was you, said you won't teach any more about problems without teaching about solutions. So I feel the same way, and I teach a whole course on movements and I teach a course on protest because that's, to me, I didn't want to just teach the class where we analyze the problems. I wanted to talk about like, how do people make change? And there's obviously, these are huge areas of study too, scholarship and so on. So I have this class, but I realized there was no way really to talk about change without like actually hearing from people engaged in it. Like they just have a wealth of wisdom and a perspective that you don't get from a textbook about movements. And so I instituted this assignment where students act, and partly because also, you all probably know this in your own schools, or at least it's true in the public schools across the country because there have been massive discussions about it. The students don't get a lot of civics education. So that's one thing I've really noticed in my classes. I wind up teaching a lot of basic stuff about like how government works. How did we get, this law passed? How do we change that thing in society? And it's unfortunate that the kids don't have a lot of that background. So when they're learning about things, they really don't have pretty vague ideas about how, if I live in this society and I want to do anything, about the environmental issues, social issues, like I don't know where to start. So I've been changing a lot of assignments to include more learning around some of those questions. And one of them was this activist interview assignment where they could actually go talk to somebody who's engaged in social change, not just in movement organizations, but also journalists, teachers, other people who, we know contribute to social change as well. And they learn a lot of civics that way because people tend to explain to them like, oh, here's why we focused on that. Here's why we went through whatever, the mayor's office, or here's why we partnered with this coalition or that organization. Anyway, it's been a fun way, and they have seemed to learn a lot that way and also enjoyed it because it's not as much book research. They actually get to go talk to people, which is good for them too because they develop their interview skills. So I wanted to just share those things with you. And my email address is on those syllabi. So if you ever have any questions or, interested in anything and want to talk sometime later after you've gotten to relax, like I said, then I'd be happy to follow up with you. Okay, so now I wanted to go back to that question about the Dust Bowl. And I'm really glad, David, you asked, but I realized after our meeting too, I was like, oh, I always, when I give talks about my book or research, I don't assume anybody's ever read anything because usually I'm somewhere where nobody's ever read an article that I've written or anything like that. I mean, maybe some people have, but often I have to tell the whole story of the Dust Bowl and a lot of people haven't heard of it, especially if they're not from the United States. So I'm explaining a lot, but I realize everyone's so caught up usually about what the Dust Bowl was, what caused it. They're surprised about the fact that it was a more international phenomenon, not just something that was happening on the plains. But no one's ever just said, well, what could we do about it? Like what could have prevented it? So there's a lot implied in what I usually talk about, but it was fun to get to kind of sit down and think about what I actually conclude based on the work that I do and everything that I've learned about what were the strategies that might have, or what were the sort of different historical moments that could have led us in very different directions, not just with respect to the Dust Bowl, but with respect to where we are today. Because I think a lot of what had the social drivers that resulted in the Dust Bowl tragedy haven't really changed, and it's one reason why we have the larger, scale ecological crises that we have today. So I need to share my screen real quick. So I also wanted to focus on changes or different directions that were actually on the table at that time, things that were actually debated, not just things that we can recognize in hindsight would have been a good idea. And so that's really what I have focused on here. So first of all, I think first and foremost, and this was probably implicit in or explicit a little bit in my research, but the first thing that could have made a big difference is if we had kept tribal lands intact in the Dust Bowl region. And so there was obviously, and I'm saying that what happened on the plains was not inevitable. Like not just the removal of tribes from the Southeast to the Oklahoma region, and from other parts of what's now the United States, so that there are about 40 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oklahoma. But also after that forced removal happened, the Dawes Allotment Act, dividing up land, privatizing the land, especially of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, that was especially harmful and obviously paved the way for this massive exploitation of the land and this sort of drive for white settlement and intensive cultivation in the region. So another thing that could have happened is that they really needed to prevent aggressive settlement in the region and this intensive cultivation of arid grasslands. So going back to the 1800s, actually, there's a famous report that was written by John Wesley Powell that was commissioned by the US government to study this area for agricultural development. And that report's pretty explicit about that this particular land couldn't handle the kind of agricultural development that was happening in other parts of the United States. And even in other parts of the United States, there were massive problems with soil erosion, but it was well understood that bringing that kind of cultivation to these grasslands and tearing up that protective layer of those tall grasses with deep roots and that complex ecosystem would cause a lot of problems. And so with respect to these issues, it's important to note that breaking up tribal land was actually a big debate. It wasn't an inevitability, and it wasn't something that everybody in government supported. So Dawes' proposal to break up land was seen by a lot of people as leading to the particular problems that it did wind up leading to for the tribes themselves and for the land. So just one example of somebody that was involved in these debates was Henry Teller, who was a Colorado senator and was Secretary of the Interior in the late 1800s. But after they passed that, the Dawes Act, which he was very opposed to, he said the entire policy of allotment was going to despoil the Indians of their lands and make them vagabonds on the face of the earth. Because obviously the tribes were primarily dependent on land, right, to make a living. There weren't alternative economic means, and people understood depriving people of their land is depriving them of their livelihood. It's also breaking up the tribe, breaking up the community, and that would have massive consequences. So Teller wasn't the only person with this view. Like I said, there were a lot of people that saw this as very cruel treatment of the tribes, and a lot of people that recognized that this was also breaking the agreements that were made during the 1830s when the tribes were removed to Oklahoma from the Southeast in particular, that they would never be disturbed on the land again. There's a famous quote, I think, of it from Andrew Jackson that said, "We're moving you here, but this is where you can find peace until the waters run dry," basically. And so that could have gone a different direction. And obviously the reservation system in other states was not dissolved. So you have it's not intact, obviously, it's a fraction of what it used to be, but you do have, Hopi, Navajo reservations in the Southwest. But in Oklahoma, all of that land was privatized. And obviously the recent Supreme Court ruling noted that this was actually illegal and in violation of treaty rights. So where that's going to go, I'm not sure. But those are things that could have really gone different directions and made a difference. So another thing that, okay, if you have already promoted settlement in the region and you have agriculture, there were definitely proposals on the table for how to transform agriculture and agrarian policy in the United States that go back to the 1800s. So you all may have heard about the People's Party, the Agrarian Populism, or the Colored Farmers Alliance in the late 19th century. So those were, their stronghold was really in the Southeast, but there were a lot of members also in Oklahoma and Indian Territory that eventually became the state of Oklahoma. So I think they had proposed a lot of different kinds of reforms that would have improved conditions for farmers and created better incentives and means, I think, to take better care of the land. And so they wanted to secure different forms of land tenure. They wanted farmers to have the opportunity to implement more cooperative land management, education, credit and distribution systems. They wanted to nationalize the banks and railroads so that farmers weren't subject to the kind of heavy debts that working with the railroads and requiring credit from banks left them in all the time. And a lot of the things that they fought for actually wound up showing up in the New Deal. So a lot of the things that were proposed that came to be part of the New Deal, they were actually struggles that go back quite a few decades before the 1930s, before the Dust Bowl happened. So those are other reforms that I think would have made a difference. So to make those, like what I see as kind of policy change, I think there are broader social conditions that would have had to change for like the populist part, the popular party to become like to have more of a chance in US politics. And this is also something that people were talking about at the time. So again, this is not just my perspective in hindsight, like these are the things people were discussing in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So people were very concerned about the dominance, obviously, of economic, especially industrial elites and money in governance and decision-making about society. The two-party system in the United States has obviously been critiqued for a very long time, but the two parties have made it very hard for, we don't have in the United States, like you have in the rest of Europe, a Labor Party, a Green Party, things like that. There's really high barriers to entry in the US to any alternative parties. So we only have these two choices, and they tend to both represent moneyed interests, much more than they represent the massive public opinion. And that's still true today. There's a lot of research that shows that. So I think it's important to remember in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a lot of revolutionary movement. So these ideas about how society could be different were really everywhere. And if you just think about 1917 alone, like right after, towards the end of World War I, or after World War I, you have like the Mexican Revolution, you have revolt in Egypt against the British, you have the Russian Revolution, you have revolts across Europe. And in Oklahoma, you actually had a massive socialist movement. I think Oklahoma gave Eugene Debs, when he was in prison for sedition during World War I, like more votes than any other state in the United States. And so it's really interesting history. Yeah, for a long time, they said the flag of Oklahoma was even illegal because it had a star on it that was supposedly a red star of some kind. Anyway, it's super interesting. And there was like a rebellion in Oklahoma in 1917 as well, of farmers and citizens of the Creek Nation who were fighting agrarian conditions in Oklahoma. So there was a lot on the table at the time. I would say also, since we're all teachers, and this was something that was discussed, and I learned about this in part by learning the history of my own discipline of sociology and the debates that were happening at the time. But I think they could have also, a lot more scientists, scholars, and educators really could have challenged some of the legitimizing ideologies that justified the status quo. So I know in sociology, there was a major division between the sociologists that really did kind of more racist science and supported the idea, supported colonization, westward expansion, colonization, and so on. And there was another group of sociologists that were just like, this isn't science, this is ideology, this is all meant to justify these barbarous practices and this barbarous expansion. And there was also, activism against US imperialism. There was a lot going on. But I think when we talk about, for example, like white supremacy, we talk about racism in our society today, I think we tend to think of these as, and maybe you all have different experiences in New York, but I know like I hear a lot in different places that, people see this as a product of ignorance, as a consequence of, it's attributed oftentimes to the poor, it's being kind of dumb, racist, backwards people. But I wanted to point out, and I thought you all might find this interesting, like, people in the United States actually had to be obviously taught racism, right? Like nobody's born thinking of themselves as white, nobody's born thinking of themselves as anything. That's all a product of socialization, identification and how you're taught to think in society. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, part of the required curriculum in public schools was the teaching of the different races of the world. And this is actually from a textbook that was taught in New York. So I'm real interested in old textbooks. They're super interesting, right? To understand how our educational institutions played a role in all of these historical developments. So this is from Warren's Common Geography that was taught all the way where I live in Massachusetts and up through New England, and was also taught in New York. So this is from the New York edition. But this is how, school kids had to learn this, that there are different states of society, different people. There are savages. There is the barbarous state of men that are somewhat more advanced than the savage. There are the half-civilized nations, and then there are the civilized nations. And they go into later in this, and I put in that resource document that I made a link to this textbook. You can go, it's all digitized, so you can look at it. They have a lot of interesting old textbooks that are digitized. So anyway, in this textbook, kids are learning about nature, they're learning about the rest of the world, and they're also being quizzed specifically on why the Caucasian race is superior to all of the other races, both on this continent and around the world. And it's very connected to this idea of commerce too, like why have the white civilizations flourished economically where everyone else is so backwards? But I mean, this is the stuff that they were teaching kids. And so but there were rebellions against this. And I think that this is another point where I think like, if educators had been more like refused en masse to teach this kind of, even back then was understood as claptrap to all kinds of people, that could have really changed the way that public, especially the white public, developed their ideas and participated in those kinds of expansionary processes. And obviously racial divisions that develop at this time have had massive consequences for the efficacy of movements and making social change and all kinds of other things. So I just wanted to bring that up. So the last thing that people talked about a lot at the time, especially even soil scientists, was the problem that, we have this idea, especially in our society, that private property means you can do with the land whatever you want, right? So in that book that I cite in my article, The Rape of the Earth, Jackson White, they're British colonial soil scientists, they point out that this was one of the main barriers to change. So they were really looking back and saying like, how can we not, like, we know basically, as they say here below, they say, we know now fairly precisely what agricultural, pastoral, forest, and engineering principles must be adapted to stop the earth from rotting away beneath our feet. but we cannot or dare not apply them forthwith on a scale commensurate with the gravity of the situation. And this really resonates with me. So this was something they understood back then, and they have this whole analysis that I think is really insightful as soil scientists, just about how much money people were making from investing in these newly colonized territories and investing in westward expansion in the United States. And they were like, they say it straight up, it's like, when there are these fat profits to be made, getting these men who have invested in this property to change course is nearly impossible. And politicians, who obviously require on the funding of some of these people doing the investing, don't want to step on the toes of property owners or the people making these investments, and say, we have this growing soil problem, soil erosion, or degradation problem. We've got to change course. And so it's interesting. And I think the 1930s, like the Depression and the Dust Bowl, led to this opening and questioning of all of these things on a scale and at a higher kind of level than had happened in the past. But there was definitely at the time a recognition that things could have gone differently, and how do we let things get so bad? Like really trying to understand, we could have done something and we didn't. Like, look at now what the tragedy that has unfolded, like look how bad it is. So they also, in this book, cite that Powell report and said, really, those grasslands in the plains should have never been plowed. Like, we knew that already, it was all predictable. So anyway, they talk about that, and they say that the men who plowed that soil were not farmers, they were actually miners of whatever fertility had existed in the earth. And so they also analyzed like foreign direct investment, how, like I just said, investment overseas was getting paid back in soil fertility at the cost to those colonized areas of their soil health and the health of their land. So there's a scholar who used to be based at Cambridge University named David Anderson, who in the 1980s was writing some of the best work on agrarian policy and agrarian colonial policy and soil conservation, focused specifically on Africa. And I remember reading one of his articles where he was really upset about the propensity in literature on soil conservation to praise the Soil Conservation Service in the United States and to praise the New Deal administration in their response to the Dust Bowl. Because he always said, like, look, these people should not be praised. They knew what, they're the ones that let things get so bad. Like, they could have definitely done something. Government should have intervened sooner. Obviously that wasn't the policy, but he said, I'm tired of people praising this, this government, this organization, this administration, when they're, they obviously have the power to do something different. And I think that what I just said is basically, I think he was a little too hard on the soil conservation scientists. I don't think they were empowered. Like, they were the ones calling for action oftentimes, even though I think they accepted too much of the status quo. They weren't challenging things in the way that they, more scientists are doing today. But I do think those broader social changes would have also had to be part of a realistic strategy to try to prevent the developments that led to the crisis in the long run. So does anybody have any questions about any of that before we move on? I know that's quick and it's not comprehensive, but I thought I would just bring in some things. Michelle?
I came across the town of Deerfield, which is an African-American town that had flourished for a good 20 years. Do you know anything about that town?
In Oklahoma?
Yeah.
Oh, no, you just made me think. I thought there's a Deerfield right next to me here in Massachusetts. I don't know Deerfield, no. Okay. Is it still there?
No, it's totally abandoned. There's
okay.
some work being done. There are very few homes that are there. It's just a sign that tells you that it existed at some point. But it spoke of, in terms of what happened to, well, it spoke about the collaboration between Black and white farmers, because there's this perception that everybody didn't get along and didn't work with one another, but it actually discussed how both Black and white farmers were very dependent on one another to survive and to do very well. But then this other issue that was discussed was in terms of the farmers not having water rights to properly irrigate the fields. and they were more reliant on just the rain. And so being that it took like 8 years for that to return, a lot of the things were just devastated. So, but I also wanted to say thank you for bringing up the issue of what's taught in school, because that still goes on today. I find like if you open a science textbook, there are no African-American scientists beyond George Washington Carver, right? There's not this integration of what others have done before, even in the history books. And I actually was at in a meeting, and a social studies teacher stated, well, it's a good thing that what happened to the Indians happened because it created America. And there's this perception, and we got into this very a nice debate, but this perception that somehow it continues to be, Europeans rescued the land and made things so much better. We wouldn't have what we have today, and we should accept that. And so it's interesting how a lot of the racism is not in the books, but not including it, not being very inclusive of in history for students that we teach. I still have to go outside of the textbook to bring in information, because I teach in East Flatbush to represent, the community that of my students, so they can see themselves in the history of science and see themselves in American history as well. So thank you for bringing that part in there, because I think students should see that it was deliberate. It's not an accident that certain individuals are left out of history books. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Those are interesting conversations. We've been at my school this year because Amherst College, just due to this activism of students and alumni, has committed to being an anti-racist campus and thinking about what that means. But the sciences have definitely been like one of the central areas where this discussion has been taking place, because a lot of half of our students are students of color. And this is what they're saying. What you just said, Michelle, is what they're saying about their experience with science too. So they're saying where do we see ourselves both represented, in terms of where our communities have contributed to scientific development, but also how they've been affected by all of the different issues that we're learning about. So it's a massive, I was just in a meeting on Friday last week with students, again, talking about how to revamp our environmental studies curriculum to bring more of those issues into our discussions, in particular of ecology and biology. They were really wanting to more of that. So it's interesting. Yeah, I think these discussions are happening everywhere, and there's still so much work to do, but it's nice to get to talk about it with you all. And I think we need to talk more for sure. Jenna?
Hi, I have a question, but I also just want to start by saying thank you so much. This feels like it feels like a revelation, and I just really appreciate your taking the time to share your work with us. You're a rare combination of someone who's doing what feels like really important scholarship, but also you're clearly a teacher, and I really appreciate that. I teach 9th grade history at Bard High School Early College, among other things, to the older kids. And you're helping me learn ways that I've never thought to connect units on imperialism and the New Deal. There's this tendency when you teach the survey to teach them as these discrete units. And so this is a beautiful bridge. My question actually is pretty specific, and it's about sources. When you showed the excerpt from the textbook, which I will definitely be grabbing from your document, it reminds me of some sources that we use when we teach the Spanish-American War. There's unfortunately a plethora of similar kinds of documents that have charts of the superiority of different races. And then you kind of quickly said there were people even at the time who challenged this teaching. And as somebody who, like so many people here, are really trying to work on transcending just teaching the bad ideology and celebrating resistance, I was wondering if you have any concrete examples of people who at that turn of the century moment did challenge that teaching in schools, because that's new to me.
Definitely. So then one of the main people that I would point you to, and like I said, I know more about sociology than I know, about anything else. And so W.E.B. Du Bois, I think, is one of the great sources where he was very concerned about what was being taught to students in schools, about all kinds of things around education. And I'm trying to think of, I have other examples in mind too. Yeah, if you should email me, because I would like to, put something together, because there are some other things. I just need to look them up and remember. But I know Du Bois is one, and some of the sources that he cites, some of the people that he was working with. Oh, the NAACP was doing a lot at the time. There were several organizations too that were doing a lot at the time to combat the eugenics and the racism that was being taught in schools. And so if I had a little more time, I could just think about like and make a list, but if you want to email me, I'd be happy, especially when we get done with classes, to put something together.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions before we carry on? Okay, great. So one of the things that comes up in this quote, they're talking about the question of scale. Like, why is it, and this really resonates to me about contemporary environmental issues too, like looking at how they were thinking about things and recognizing that people were willing to implement certain kinds of solutions, but nothing big enough to really tackle the problem. And I think this, for all of us who teach in environmental fields or teach adjacent to them, but are thinking about environmental issues and social issues, this is always a question, right? It's like, how do we promote things that are able to actually make a difference with the kinds of problems that we're looking at? And I just wanted to have us think before getting into the readings about this question of scale a little bit more. So this is a chart, this I pulled from the photo of the Ecological Footprint Foundation. I don't know, you all probably use the Ecological Footprint maybe in class. Anyway, this is the most recent data that they published in 2021, even though it only goes to 2017, but that's the lag they have doing all of this research and calculation. So in their most recent data, the average, the per capita footprint of somebody living in the United States, or the per capita ecological footprint of the United States, means that it would take 5.03 Earths if everyone in the world lived like your average American. So 5 Earths, that's the kind of work they do. If you haven't played around with the ecological footprint data, it's super helpful. I find it really helpful for students in conceptualizing the overall weight of our society and how it's organized on the planet. So, I mean, that's obviously something really dramatically has to change. Like, we don't have 5 Earths, right? And not everybody obviously is living like this, but it's a real problem. And it means that we have specific, I think, responsibilities in the United States. So that's the big picture, like ecological footprint, but obviously everybody in the United States doesn't live the same way, right? And you all know this, we are one of the most, if not the most unequal industrial country, wealthy country in the entire world at this point. And so we have massive inequality. And as this Bloomberg article says, the 50 richest Americans are worth as much as the poorest half of the population. That's how concentrated wealth is in this country. And this is one of the things I really try to get across to students, because I think it's so normal for a lot of us. We've lived in this place, and because of social distance, I mean, real social distance, not what we're doing with COVID, but the fact that most of us grow up around people like us, not different kinds of people. A lot of people are not aware of how different other people's lives are than their own. And the class, the sort of class divisions that we have today and how those are racialized and gendered. So all of the research on inequality shows there are massive inequalities by wealth, and the majority of that wealth held at the top is still held by white men. And that has profound consequences for trying to address environmental issues. So because of that inequality, you see massive differences when you break down like ecological footprint, or in this case, carbon footprint by different economic groupings. So in the United States, which is, as you can see, an outlier here at the top of the chart, those in the upper 10% of the income and wealth scale in the United States have household CO2 emissions that are more than 5 times what the bottom 50%, of society, or bottom 40%. And you see this inequality across different countries, but obviously in the United States is particularly extreme. And so I don't know if you all have read, Joseph Stiglitz won the Nobel Prize for economics. He's written a lot about, one of his books I really liked was The High Price of Inequality, but he's written a lot about, and this conforms to everything that we study in sociology about how big of a barrier this inequality is to getting environmental policy passed in the US. Because basically the people who benefit from what's happening the most have the least interest in making change, and they tend to really dominate politics because of the level of inequality that we have. And so the wealth and the sort of what it takes to participate in politics today, especially since the Citizens United ruling in the Supreme Court that's made it like corporations and wealthy be able to give unlimited amounts of funds to campaigns without it even being public. You know, this has made it very, it's identified as one of the major factors and one of the major barriers to change. So we also tend to think in terms of individuals a lot instead of institutions when we think about environmental impact. And so I just wanted, it comes up in one of the readings for today, but I also think it's important, like the United States military and some of our other institutions are some of the biggest polluters in the entire world. And this is just not talked about very much, but I think it's really important because it contributes massively to our responsibility in this country for the impacts of climate change and other things overseas. And then there's a whole other question of what the military is used for that you could also talk about. So as a consequence of this massive inequality and the concentration of wealth at the top, like I just said, not only do especially economic elites have an outsized influence on politics in the United States, but they also tend to have an outsized influence on environmental discourse in the United States. And so this is something that a lot of scholars in environmental sociology study, from climate denial to other ways that they influence environmental discourse and activism, especially through foundation funding. But you have today elites like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and obviously all of these fossil fuel companies really putting a lot of money into certain kinds of environmental organizations to promote certain ideas about what constitutes environmental solutions and environmental change. And this is a picture of the scientists, the climate scientist that you all might have heard of before, Michael Mann. He was attacked very heavily when he first came out with his climate research. He was attacked by the right wing, like his life was threatened and so on. But it's interesting because his recent research is really focused on the barriers to change and the role. He studied the role of fossil fuel companies in promoting science to climate science denial. But now he's got a new book focused on how they've shifted from climate science to denial to what he calls a politics of inactivism. And so he summarizes in this book, and I think it's really interesting, he calls them something like the 6 Ds, I think. But he says that today the fossil fuel industry, while they're still promoting science denial, and they've also funded a lot of the politicians who have been denying the election results and things like that as well, which I think is important to think about. He said they're also starting to put out through their public relations offices, through the advocacy groups that they fund, and through think tanks, these perspectives on the environment. So one is he talks about how their focus is really tried to shift the discussion to individual versus collective solutions. So we should think about our carbon footprint, we should think about recycling, but not think about regulation, reining in, putting a cap on wealth, corporate taxes to pay for environmental cleanup and things like that. So another tactic that he talks about is their tactic of delay, that we don't need to go big, it's better to go slow, get buy-in and so on. They also, he's pointed out, have been putting out more materials recently, really trying to sow racial division and block alliances between movements. So environmentalism is a white thing. It's not for people of color, but it's super interesting. His book is really interesting. And then also he said they've been promoting despair mongering. So climate change just can't be stopped. It's too big of a problem and we can't do anything. And he also says doomism, that we're just all going to die, which I think is kind of funny because I don't think like that, but I have to say there is a lot of that on the internet. Like if you go and look at it, there's a lot of that. And it's obviously hugely disempowering. So I brought this in basically before we get started thinking about the readings to have us think about the ways we need to be very critical about not only how we understand the drivers of ecological crises, but also what we accept in terms of our assumptions about what constitutes environmental change, like environmental solutions. And I think it's helpful, it's definitely helpful for me as a scholar to be aware of where some of these ideas are coming from, right? And why they're, because I find them very prevalent amongst my students, especially the focus on individual solutions, like the focus on, in green consumerism, which I have a whole lecture on that, but we won't have time to get into that, but like where that originated and how corporations have really tried to push the idea that if you buy green, like as in, well, one, to push our identity of ourselves as consumers rather than community members, activists, workers, things like that, but also how they've really pushed green consumption rather than what would be much better, which is actually buying less, right? Just not buying stuff, like getting out of that situation and working together in different kinds of ways. So those are things I wanted to put out there before we get into the reading. And I wanted to, does anyone have any questions or thoughts about any of that? If it's repeating any stuff you've already heard and thought about a lot, I'm sorry, but I just, okay, awesome. All right, so now I would really like to, as we're thinking about this question of scale, thinking about what constitutes environmental solutions, I assigned a few things for you to read today that I think, help, I was hoping kind of help us think on a broad scale about what, how do these things come together? How do we think about historical change? How do we think about environmental solutions that are reparative, that are just, that don't, cause more harm in the process, like a lot of the history of conservation has. And so I assigned one of the articles that introduces the work of Malcolm Ferdinand, which is only available in French. And so I couldn't assign any parts of it, and my French is really bad anyway, so I can barely read it myself. But anyway, but it's going to come out in English, and I just wanted to put it on your radar because it's won several awards already. And I think it's just a really interesting story outside of the US context, which I think is important. And he's this scholar activist from Martinique who's doing super interesting work thinking about what do just transitions look like, to use that language. He doesn't put it that way. But I think that that's super interesting. And I thought the person who wrote the short summary of the issues did a really good job too. So I thought that would be something we could talk about. There were also a couple of other articles about indigenous people as land protectors, and also that are facing the way that as land protectors, they're facing criminalization and murder and threats to their life around the world. And the other piece that I assigned was from the Red Nation, which that was probably a really different piece in the language. It might have been jarring for some people, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's from an activist organization, as you can tell. But I thought it was important to look in the US context, or the authors of that are from Canada and the United States, and they're scholars and indigenous activists. But I thought it might be interesting. It just was launched on Earth Day this year. And I just think some of the ways that they are formulating the connections between things I thought would be worth bringing in and interesting to you all. So I wanted to show you one more thing before we just get into discussion. And that is a clip by one of the women who co-authored. There were 22 co-authors to the Red Nations. They produced a book actually, and you all read a portion of that. And I thought it might be helpful, rather than me try to explain it, you could just hear from her just what they were trying to do with that pamphlet. Let me share again. Okay. Can everybody see? Okay, let me make it bigger though. Okay, so there's a little film, like a short, like 1 minute thing from Earth Justice. And this is an interview on Democracy Now! So they're just showing this little clip and then it gets right into, and I'm just gonna show a few minutes of it, but with an interview with Melanie Yazzie, who's one of the co-authors of that pamphlet.
My name is Future. My mind remembers, but the heart feels it. It was the gathering of all directions. Standing Rock, 2016. That's where it all began. Thousands answered the call and came together to protect our river.
President Biden, you can be on the right side of history. Shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline.
More than 2 centuries of indigenous resistance led up to the movement at Standing Rock that proclaimed water is life. We spend the rest of the hour discussing this history and a vision for the future that's laid out in a new book published today titled The Red Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. We're joined by 2 of the book's 24 indigenous authors in Albuquerque. Melanie Yazzie is co-founder of the Red Nation, a grassroots indigenous liberation organization, chair of the board of directors for Red Media, an imprint of Common Notions. Red Deal is Red Media's first publication. Yazzie is a citizen of the Navajo Nation. She's Dine, assistant professor of Native American Studies and American Studies, University of New Mexico. We are also joined from Toronto by Uwahiki Maile, a Kanaka Maoli scholar and activist from Maunawili, Oahu. He's also a member of the Red Nation, assistant professor of indigenous politics at the University of Toronto. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Thank you so much for joining us. Melanie Yazzie, let's begin with you on this Earth Day. If you can talk about the Red Plan, the Red Deal.
Sure. So the Red Deal is essentially a people's program to prevent extinction. You know, we talk a lot in the Red Deal about, like, the plan is really clear. The stakes are really clear. It's decolonization or extinction. And the reason why we use the language of decolonization is because we draw centrally from indigenous movements over the last couple of decades for decolonization. You know, indigenous people have been on the front lines of the struggle for climate justice, you know, since 1492. But more recently, as the call for climate justice has been reverberating across the globe to address kind of this we're actually at a 29-year, right, clock towards climate disaster. You know, indigenous people, whether it's at Standing Rock, the clip you just showed, Apache people fighting Resolution Copper, or Uahekea's people fighting the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii. You know, indigenous people have really been on the front lines of the struggle to advance the climate justice movement. And so we draw really centrally from that. And that's why we say decolonization or extinction. You know, and we can really trust indigenous movements historically. So indigenous people make up 5% of the world's population, but we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, which of course is incredibly important when we're thinking about climate change and curbing climate change. And also something the Red Deal does, because we do claim that you can trust indigenous movements because we've been on the front lines and we've been fighting this battle for so long, you know, is that we draw really centrally from indigenous knowledge. And the way that we talk about indigenous knowledge in relationship to climate justice is not the same way that we're often sort of cast or stereotyped in the mainstream environmental movement, which is often sort of a spiritual or a cultural window dressing, right, to the larger mainstream claims about climate justice and environmental justice. But for us, what constitutes indigenous knowledge are actually indigenous traditions of governance and science and technology that are really premised on caretaking our relations, right? So Vine Deloria Jr. once said that the crisis that we're facing as a species, as a globe, it's not actually climate change. He said we've simply fallen out of right relation with the earth, right? We belong to a nation and a people who, instead of caretaking the earth and seeing the earth as a relative, we prey on the earth, right? We have a predatory relation. And so what we argue for in the Red Deal from an indigenous perspective is that the reason why climate change is happening is because we have fallen out of right relation with the earth. And B, what we need to do to rectify the situation is to draw from indigenous people's experience on the front lines of climate justice and really enter back into right relation with the earth. And we propose a couple of ways to do this. The first, and we draw really centrally from calls for abolition that are coming from the Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives movements, for the abolition of carceral institutions, right? The institutions that cause the most harm: prisons, police, the US military. You know, Amy, you just said in the previous segment, you know, there are calls to reduce funding for the Pentagon, right, to pull out of Afghanistan. Why don't we take the money that goes into harming people and put it instead and to reinvest it into that which gives people life and dignity? Healthcare, education, COVID-19 vaccines, infrastructure, transportation, right? Housing, those types of things. And so the Red Deal really talks about this from an abolitionist perspective. So we see that elevating the dignity of working class and poor people is really central to an indigenous interpretation of climate justice from a decolonial perspective. And I'll just say one more thing, you know, something that we, and I'll talk a little bit more about this perhaps in the next few minutes, but something that we talk a lot about in the Red Deal is that when we were looking at the Green New Deal, which was the impetus for the Red Deal, we found that it was not comprehensive, perhaps, or extensive enough. It's quite a short document, at least the one that was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And in early 2019, we decided to sit down and think through what would it mean to indigenize the Green New Deal? And that's where the Red Deal was born. And for us, part of what that means is that we have to take a much stronger stance than the Green New Deal does on global imperialism, or US imperialism and global capitalism as the primary kind of philosophy of falling out of right relation with the earth. And so we really draw centrally from the Cochabamba agreement and the People's Gathering of 2011 in Bolivia, which had an explicitly anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist perspective on what indigenous people are saying about climate justice. And so these are some of the things that are really at the heart of the Red Deal. It's an action-based program. Red Nation has always been a very action-based organization, and it's really meant for everybody to kind of dig in. There are multiple entry points, and it really embraces the diversity of tactics.
Okay, that was the best short introduction I could find to that work that's just been kind of ongoing, and they really just launched this document. So, oh, I see a cat has joined us. Awesome. All right, so now I'd just really like to, I know that we don't have a long, endless amount of time together, but I would love to open things up and to talk about the reading. I think it might be nice to do it all together rather than break out into groups, given the time that we have. And so I wanted to start by just asking if we could talk about what captured your attention in the readings and why, and did anything that you read make you think differently about what constitutes environmental solutions? That was the first question I wanted to ask. Annie?
Yeah, I actually just had a question. So as I was reading these, and I'd read like some of the stuff recently, like I don't know if you saw the article in the Atlantic about returning all of the parks in America to indigenous lands. And then also I was listening to some other podcasts about like carbon offsets and do they really work and are they really real and can you trust them and all of these sorts of things. And I'm someone who has, you know, environmental causes are near and dear to my heart. And so I give to a lot of environmental organizations. And so I was wondering if you had any recommendations of organizations that support indigenous land owning, because it seems clear to me from the reading that is one of the best ways to support the environment.
So I know, I mean, Red Nation that published that particular, what you all read for today would be one of them. I'm sure that they're not a wealthy organization. I mean, a lot of the discussion in the environmental movement, I mean, you all might have heard of Green 2.0. It's an organization that was started by, well, Dorceta Taylor, who's an environmental sociologist. She used to be at Michigan, now she's at Yale. But she started it really trying to hold environmental organizations accountable for who they have in leadership positions, how they interact with communities, and how they, where they get their money. And so one of the biggest things that comes out of that work is like a lot of the foundation funding tends to go to the wider, more mainstream organizations, partly because of where the foundation money comes from, I think, in the interests of those donors. But I know that repeatedly in through the history of like environmental justice movement and indigenous like land back movement, they've just called for more and more funds directly to those community-based organizations, and the organizations doing like direct work with those communities rather than through some of the bigger green NGOs and organizations that then you have to kind of rely on their goodwill to use that appropriately with respect to these tribal nations. And so I think Red Nation is one. I know Greenpeace has done a lot of work to try to make historical amends, make amends for their history of how they've dealt with indigenous nations. So they have been doing a lot of reinvesting in tribal communities, and they have supported land back, but I don't know if that's actually a program like as part of their work or a statement. That's a good question. Leslie?
Thank you. So I guess what stood out to me is how direct Malcolm Ferdinand was in him calling out that ecology being a white thing, and how kind of explicit he's being in the need to undo that thinking and really resist the dominant narrative. And just these quotes of his are extraordinary. We need to think of environmental issues and climate change not just in terms of social justice, but also in terms of an emancipation from the colonial legacy and structural racism. And it made me think, reading this and then reading the Red Deal. I follow Jamal Bowman. I live in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm just lucky to get in on this New York thing because of Zoom. But I know Jamal Bowman might be some of all of you all's congressmen, and he shared recently about the red, black, and green New Deal, which is a black climate agenda. So I'm just excited. I mean, I'm excited about both. Hi, I'm excited about both. And, this is the kind of stuff that I really am most excited to bring to students, because students' politics are this. Students are very willing to be critical of capitalism, very willing to be critical of colonialism. And I think these sorts of sources and agendas are very validating to 16, 17-year-olds. So it's exciting to see. Also, just another resource is I use a lot from the Zinn Education Project, and they did a great role play that brings indigenous voices to the table in crafting climate solutions. And I can drop it in the link. But one of the things that comes to mind is oftentimes when we're talking indigenous folks, we think the Americas, we think maybe Asia, but oftentimes, and I didn't see a ton in the sources here of thinking about African people when we're talking about indigenous land and indigenous rights. And the Zinn Education Project does bring the Bambara people to the table in the role play. But I was just wondering if you had any more insights about the fight for climate justice coming from specific regions in Africa.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm trying to think. So I'm more probably because of language reasons, like aware of stuff in South Africa than anywhere else. And so there is a writer named Patrick Bond that has written about climate justice in that context. And I do feel like that's another thing. I think that if I could think about it a little bit, I definitely, in all the stuff that I read all the time, have come across different things. Just sometimes I'm not good in the late in the day about coming with things off the top of my head, but Patrick Bond is one person I think of, but I know there's a lot more. So if you, again, if you email me, I'd love to think about that, because it'd be good for me to have that at my fingertips too. So
I will, for sure.
I also think, since you mentioned youth and like what's inspiring, like what inspires them, I think it's important to remember, like Standing Rock, the whole mobilization against the No DAPL mobilization was started by young people, like by youth activists. I mean, they have an incredible organizing committee, and that is one of the major mobilizations that has, I think, freaked out the fossil fuel industry, that you had more white kids and environmentalists and more multiracial organizing. And I think that's one reason that they've been putting more effort into sowing racial division and funding these politicians that sow racial division, because I think that's one of the things that obviously people in sociology have studied this for a long time, but that's obviously one of the major ways to disempower movements is to get people not to see each other as community and family, and not to build solidarity. So
Yeah, the kids are cooler to hang with than adults for sure.
Katrina?
I actually think I did the same activity Leslie did with her kids, but I don't know if you did the climate activist workshop that was on the Zinn website. Yeah, okay. So I teach 8th grade, and I'm wondering, my kids have a hard time grasping everything about the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, I don't know if there's anyone that, most of you are like high school, like how to kind of get them to understand the differences between the Green New Deal and the Red New Deal. They're understanding like the foundational aspects of what's happening. They all did like a biography on one of the activists, and we turnkeyed it to our elementary school age kids that study the Lenape, which just seemed like a perfect fit. But when we get to like the court cases, when we look at like what happened with line 3, it's literally like we have to stop every like 2 seconds to define everything. So I was just wondering if anyone had any ideas about maybe bringing it down for middle school.
Sounds like that's something that we could all give some thought to and bring back to the table when all of you teachers meet again on Tuesday, because I think it is a really great question. Although, Katrina, I do remember how sophisticated the work your students do is. So 8th graders with Katrina are like 10th and 11th graders with everybody else. So just so we know. But I think it's a great question to maybe come back to next week.
Also, it's a social studies based school and it's an independent school, so they have a different like background, and our school doesn't focus on science and math that much. So it's a different world. Thanks.
I wish I would have had Katrina for a middle school teacher. Definitely didn't. We would have not been talking about any of that in my school for sure. Gail?
Hi. I have a question about the reading that we did last night, the optional reading, which was your chapter, in which you bring up this idea of African land grabs by Western investment companies. So I just happened to be hanging out yesterday with my sister and my brother-in-law, and I said, I was just reading this really interesting article, and it's about African land grabs by these Western investment companies. And my sister and my brother-in-law happened to have taught in Rwanda for like 6 weeks last year, right before the pandemic. And what they told me was that in Rwanda, there's only sustenance farming, and there's all the land that can be farmed there's no like extra land. And the land is passed down from generation to generation. And sometimes this causes problems because, you know, if one family passes, like, you know, a couple pass down the land to their 4 sons, and then their 4 sons have to sustain themselves off the land the way their parents did, it obviously becomes unsustainable. So I guess what they were arguing was that, you know, I guess they were making that argument that Native people aren't good at coping with their, you know, managing themselves and managing the land. And I didn't really have an argument against them. So I was just wondering what you would say to that.
Well, I would just say it's the same thing that happened in the United States. So Carolyn Merchant, in her book, Ecological Revolutions, Gender, Nature, Science in New England, talks about how that very same thing has happened here in New England in particular. Is one of the challenges that smaller farmer and small farm families for whom the only wealth they have is their land to pass on, like had to deal with. So this is another thing that came up, and it has to come up in Rwanda, but I don't know examples off the top of my head, but it must be a conversation, I would imagine, amongst rural activists, because this is a conversation happening in other places that are still more agrarian than the United States is now, obviously. And so I would imagine that there are discussions of like, what do you do when you have that division that makes it harder to, co-manage the land and harder to produce on the scale that you need in a more integrated way. So I think one, you're like the folks you were talking to should know, like that's an issue that pervades agrarian societies, especially more patriarchal ones like the United States was, where they're passing on to sons and dividing this land. But it's also a product of fewer opportunities off farm for the children of people for whom, like I said, this is the only wealth and the only way to make a living. And so anyway, those are the things that I would have to say about that. But I would imagine, I mean, like if you look up Via Campesina's work, the big organization that has sister organizations all around the world, I know that that's been a topic of conversation in their work. I don't know what their presence is in Rwanda, but I imagine there's also more local groups having that discussion. So it'd be interesting to know what they say and how they think about how to deal with it, because it definitely generated a crisis of agriculture in New England, and you can see all the reasons why that would happen there too.
Can you just repeat the name of the author? It was Carolyn Merchant?
Yeah, she's a pretty well-known environmental historian and philosopher of science. I actually put her in that document that I shared with you all, because I think she's an interesting person just on the history of science too, like thinking about that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Emily?
Yeah, so one thing I was kind of thinking about as I was reading through, especially the articles about the decolonial ecology and stuff like that, was how maybe to best then revise a model of conservation that we have in this country and other countries, right? Because we have these national parks where people are allowed to use them for recreation, right? But it seems like often whenever you have a new national park, the solution is kick everybody out, right? Not just here, but in other countries around the world too. And kind of what would be a model that would sustain natural resources while also promoting indigenous use of lands?
That's a great question. I have this amazing thesis student right now who's been studying that in particular, and she's done such good work. We're going to try to get it turned into an academic publication over the summer, I think. But this is something a lot of people are asking, so it's a hot topic. And she was actually in interviewing indigenous women and activists in the Southwest, thinking about the national parks in that region and so on. But I mean, one of the things that so that's called, what you described is known in the literature and amongst environmentalists as fortress conservation. So if you want to look it up, like there's a whole kind of literature about the problems that have been caused by fortress conservation, and the fact that it comes from a philosophy that really separates humanity from nature, and the idea that we can only preserve nature if we kick all the people out. Obviously, it's not usually kicking out white people, it's usually kicking out somebody else, or I think it would be a very different conversation amongst environmentalists. But one of the there's two things that come up a lot in the literature, and one is more co-management of those places and spaces and resources like rivers. And so there's a whole rights-based movement too, the rights of nature, and like having indigenous groups work with governments to co-manage places. But obviously a lot of activists have also called for, and I think there are good empirical arguments for it, good empirical evidence for it, for land back, and then letting the tribes manage it, letting the tribes manage their traditional lands themselves. And so I think those are the two most common so-called solutions to what has been the, forced removal of so many people for fortress conservation. Those are the two kind of models people are exploring and thinking about.